Hey everyone, Cleo here and welcome to my channel, and today I'll be doing another book talk, and that is for Eating Animals by Safran Foer. Now, I've just had an event by Safran Foer, and that's actually basically the reason why I'm reading so much Safran Foer right now. So Safran Foer came to live and to present his latest novel, We Are the Weather, to us, which I might also still try to fit in this month, but as my TBR was already way too ambitious, I don't know whether I'll be getting around to it. So We Are the Weather is kind of his second non-fiction book, which is all about environmentalism, and his first one is Eating Animals, which in a way ties in very much with that subject. You know, animal consumption is basically the major contributor to global warming at this point, and so reducing the amount of animals we eat would definitely help a lot with changing with saving our planet basically. But it is not the main focus of Eating Animals. Eating Animals is very much a look into the meat industry and a look into the practices going on in the meat industry, and it's basically an honest search for should we stop eating animals, and mainly it's looking then in the angle of the animal cruelty, because he does also mention in this book due alone to the environmental impact of eating animals, you cannot really call yourself environmentalist if you don't want to consider changing the amount of meat you eat, or even if you don't want to become a non-meat eater at all. So he takes that as a given, so he doesn't explore into that part of the book too much. So if you're more interested in like the environmental impact of eating animals, then I think this one is not for you. That is probably better to read his new release, which isn't out yet in the US, which is We Are the Weather. I would, however, say that just because you're more interested in the environmental impact of things, it isn't necessarily to say that you shouldn't be reading this book. What Safran Foer is basically claiming in this book, which I definitely believe to be true, is that on a certain level we are all aware of animal cruelty and of the practices taking place in the meat industry. However, we've chosen to forget about it. We've chosen that in order to clear our conscience and be able to continue eating meat, we've chosen not to really pay close attention to what is happening there. And this is necessary for us to be able to consume meat, but it's also very hypocritical. And for that sense alone, I feel like this book needs to be read. Just in order to, I don't mean everybody needs to become a vegetarian or something like that. It would definitely help out a lot to save our planet. I'm not saying like read this book and then I'm not accusing anybody of eating meat and not looking into it. I totally understand that. I'm also still eating fish, and I know horrible things are happening there. But I do feel like we should be more informed about what is happening to get to that piece of meat on our plates. You know, at the end of reading this book, you can still continue eating meat. I'm still eating fish, though I am definitely cutting back even more. But I do feel like it's important for us to not deceive ourselves in this anymore. If you cannot leave that piece of meat out of your diet, sure, I can understand that, but I do feel like you shouldn't be shying away from the reality of how that piece of meat ended up on your plate. So in Eating Animals, Safran Foer explores the ways in which animals are being treated in our meat industry. He takes a look at different types of animals, of course. He looks at pig farms, he looks at cattle ranches, he looks at the chicken industry, both like the chickens used for eggs or the chickens that are produced for their meat. He also looks at the turkey farms at the very end of this book, and he kind of shows how these practices are widespread. But he doesn't just look at the factory farm, which is the model which is like responsible for, at least in the US where most of this research is based on, is kind of responsible for 99% of the meat being produced in the US. And the factory farm is basically the worst case scenario which we have in our mind of this very small cages, very small confinements in which a lot of animals are stuck together, in which they are being treated not very humanely. They're basically being treated as something disposable, something that doesn't have feelings or that cannot feel pain. And so they endure a whole lot of suffering, a whole lot of cruelty. Situations are very unhygienic and things like that. And that is basically our worst case scenario, which is definitely delved into a lot. But he also looks at the alternative, you know, at the old-fashioned farms, which are still going at it the old way. But what he's definitely showing is how much these are struggling and how much competition they are feeling from the big factory farms, which are taking over the industry by storm. I'm not going to go too much into the cruelty aspects of this because I want to keep my video also somewhat family friendly, and I want to repulse you guys here, and then you can still make up your mind whether you want to go in depth into this, because I definitely do feel that you still need to have the freedom of choice there. I would definitely encourage you to read it just so that you can stop deceiving yourself to a certain extent, but I will also understand if you don't want to go into it. It is definitely uncomfortable and it's very, very confrontational at times, just because we are aware of this happening, we know it in our subconscious and we never want to explore it, and so it can become uncomfortable at times, but I will say that it has been reduced a whole lot. I mean, we are looking at certain situations at times and you're like, oh, I didn't know this, or I hadn't thought about this or that aspect of the industry, about, for example, the huge amount of animal waste. You know, when we're talking about food waste, we usually think about it in terms of like, okay, us and our refrigerator, you know, how much of our refrigerator we are throwing away. But there's also so much food waste going on in the production of food as well, you know. It's also talking about the fact that red meat, so meat that comes from cows, is actually very insufficient. It's like it's very wasteful in a sense, because you need to put a big chunk of calories into a cow in order to get like 1 calorie out. I think you need to put 60 calories into a cow to get 1 calorie out of the cow, which means that the huge amount of food that is being wasted there is all of the food that we are feeding to these cows in order to get meat out of it that feeds us. So basically, I don't know whether it was in this book that he made this analogy. I don't think so. I think it was in his talk. He's basically saying like all of that food that goes into these cows could actually save a whole lot of people that are dying from hunger all around the world every single day. On this exploration, Safran Foer tried to talk to as many people as possible. He tried to visit one of these factory farms as well, but he wasn't allowed in anywhere. He did go on a sort of break-in with a member of PETA in order to see the reality of a factory farm himself. But so the way he kind of solves the problem of not really having a peek inside the facilities themselves is he has conversations with people from all angles of the industry. So he talks to people who are, for example, members of PETA, who are trying to end animal cruelty, but also members of the assembly line who work there, people who work in like the more sustainable versions, you know, the more old-fashioned idea we have about farms. So people who are cattle ranchers. He interviews the wife of a cattle rancher who's vegetarian but still runs the business of this cattle farm, and so he gets a number of different perspectives, which also helps in establishing how it helps in establishing a sort of neutrality in his writing. It doesn't make you feel like, okay, this is just his interpretation of things and he is just giving a one-sided story. He's not giving a one-sided story. Through these many different testimonials, he's giving a very widespread view on the industry itself. He's also not saying what I also think is very crucial to enjoyment of this book, or to this book being able to be read by anybody. Also, what I think is very important for this book is that in no way is he ever using an accusatory tone. He's never condemning people for eating meat, you know. He's just showing the reality of the meat industry in order to have people make a more informed decision. I think one of the things that he mentions, which really was striking, was the fact that all of these factory farms are kind of difficult to get into, you know. It's kind of like breaking into a fortress, and he's saying that is actually very interesting, because there is no reason to lock up a farm, you know. what could be the reason to put a lock on the door of a farm? Because I mean, there's not that much of value to be stolen from there, and in order to steal those animals, you would have to like have a major operation involved in order to be able to steal all of those animals out of the farm. So basically, what that lock is for is basically to keep people out, to keep people from seeing the reality of what is going inside. And when you have to resort to those types of measures, then most likely what is happening inside isn't really something that we would condone. I think what is very important to note about this, because it is a non-fiction book and you can maybe kind of get the impression that it's going to be long-winded or it's going to be very factual and very dry, but it definitely isn't. You know, Safran Foer is started out as a fiction writer. He writes fiction and non-fiction at this point, and so his writing style in here is also very much reminiscent of his fiction style. So he's it's experimental in parts as well, and he's using different resources. So he's telling the story of his exploration into the industry. He's intermixing that with interviews with people. He's giving letters from people and things like that. But he's also very much telling a story. And in this book, he's also very much telling that the reason why we eat animals is because of stories, because of more or less our cultural tradition. You know, eating meat is very much linked to certain stories we tell each other. We tell each other about. So the taste of certain meats is linked to a recipe from our grandmother, for example, or those good old days when my grandmother would make rabbits with prunes, for example. I have very fond memories of that. And also, for example, Thanksgiving, the whole idea of sharing the turkey, even though if you look into the history of it, he's saying that the turkey wasn't even part of the original Thanksgiving, it's just something that got added in later. But the way we eat meat is very much linked to stories we tell each other, to habits, to traditions, and that is making it extra difficult to stop eating meat. Eating meat for us is not just a sustenance, it's not just something we eat in order to survive, it is something we eat because it is very much part of our tradition, of our history. And so it is a big step to step away from that, and that is what is making it so difficult. But what he's saying is we need to kind of make ourselves a new story in order to stop eating meat. So I think I hope I've addressed the major concerns you might have for starting this book. So the first of which I think I mentioned at the beginning. So like 3 objections you could have to reading this book is: 1, you don't want to become a vegetarian; 2, you're uncomfortable about reading about animal cruelty; and 3, you don't want to get into a dry non-fiction read. So for the first ones who don't want to become vegetarians, I would say I definitely have examples of people who read this book who haven't become vegetarian. And I think we owe it to the meat on our plates, to the animals who died to provide us with that meat, to at least not shy away from the reality of eating animals. I have no problem if you decide that you cannot cut out meat or you cannot limit the amount of meat that you're eating, but I do feel like in those cases you do need to know the reality of how that meat ended up on your plate. I do hope that the majority of the people who will read this will at least lower their intake on meat, especially considering how this is such a hot topic at these times and how many people, how it has been fully established that lowering our intake of meat is necessary in order to save our planet. For the second ones, the ones who are uncomfortable with reading about animal cruelty, I'll say yes, there is definitely animal cruelty in this part, and in parts of this book you will feel uncomfortable. However, I feel also like the most important literature is the literature that makes you uncomfortable, because when you're uncomfortable you're going beyond your normal boundaries, you're exploring things that you're exploring parts of your reality that you might not be happy about, and that is necessary in order to get to a change. And thirdly, for the ones who are thinking of this as a dry non-fiction book, this never to me felt like a non-fiction in the sense of like books that I've read before that are non-fiction, which are very much stating facts and things like this. This is very much a journey you are taking with the author to find the facts and to find an interpretation to the facts, and your interpretation to these facts might be different than the one that the author reaches. In any case, I think Safran Foer is a very interesting character, and that he has a very interesting perspective on the world. I will also place an interview down below that he had on Belgian television about his latest book, We Are the Weather, but I definitely feel like these two books are tied in, you know. This is looking more at the animal cruelty side of eating animals, but in We Are the Weather, one of the major things that we can do in order to save our planet is to lower our intake of meat. Ideally by stopping altogether, but I'm also not doing that because I'm still eating fish, but just lowering by a huge amount can already have a significant influence. And so I think this is a very important book to read, and I hope that more people will be reading it. I know it can make you feel uncomfortable, and I will also be watching the movie of this, so there's a documentary about this as well. And I'm also already dreading that because there's a difference between reading about animal cruelty and really seeing it. So I'm expecting for that movie to be even more confrontational. But so yeah, I hope you enjoyed this talk on Eating Animals by Safran Foer. Definitely let me know down below if you're interested in this book or if you've already read it and what your take on it was. If you have any other objections to reading this book, definitely let me know down below, and then if I have any take on it, I will definitely let you know. But so yeah, see you guys for the next one. Bye!